Well, maybe you can hear me anyway. But again, welcome to our November meeting. I'm sorry I missed last month. I understand I missed a good one. But I'm looking forward to this one also because we've been trying to track down Mr. Picerno for a number of years, actually, since he joined. He's from Vermont, and Warren will go into that a little later. But we received a letter from him, I think it was a couple of years ago, joining us and telling us about his expertise about the 10th and was it 10th and 20th or 29th Maine. So we were, as I say, Warren's been trying to track him down for several months now. There are just several things I wanted to bring up tonight. First off, sort of an unofficial Treasury report. We've got $773 in the Treasury, so obviously we're very liquid. And the membership is creeping up little by little. We've got 40 plus, but that's a far cry from what we had last year. So we're hoping that but from the looks of the turnout tonight, this is outstanding. And I might say I don't see anybody standing, but we're going to have other chairs in here very shortly. And it looks like we're going to need them. You're going to have a good turnout tonight, Mr. Picerno. Another thing I wanted to bring up was that Warren and I decided we'd rent a post office box for our mail. And it's going to be printed in the newsletter every month so that you'll have a chance. If you have any reason to communicate with us, sending in your dues or anything, it'll be to the post office box, which will be 1046. And as I say, that'll be printed in the newsletter every month. So you'll have that. Rather than the Chamberlain House, we used to have it sent to the Chamberlain House, but that was very awkward because there was nobody there to pick it up. And sometimes Warren wouldn't get around to it, and it'd end up at the Pajemskit Historical Society for a while, and trying to run it down just seemed to be very peculiar. And so this seemed to solve the problem, we thought, most efficiently. Another interesting little thing that happened, Warren received a letter from a gentleman in New York, Utica, New York, who joined our round table, along with the one that's out in California. This seems a little unusual, but it was interesting because he had just finished reading the Angels. Killer Angels, yeah. I couldn't think of that word for some reason. Killer Angels, and he was fascinated by Chamberlain. So he heard about our round table and wrote a letter expressing his interest in it and exclaiming and proclaiming Chamberlain and how he was fascinated by him and wanted to join. And so naturally we wrote back and invited him, hopefully, that he might attend a meeting sometime in the future, but all the way from Utica. That was kind of interesting, I thought. The other thing I wanted to mention today was, as you may know, we subscribe to this Civil War Roundtable Associates, and we get it every month, and it has a few little blurbs. And we're going to join again. But anyway, usually they have, they mention any meetings they're going to have throughout the country. Obviously, it's mostly in the in Virginia area and in Pennsylvania and so forth, for tours of battlefields and seminars and so forth. So I thought I'd bring this one up in case anybody might be interested. This one is going to be in April 6th, 7th, and 8th. That's a Thursday, Friday, and a Saturday. Also a Sunday. I see they got an optional tour. But it's going to be on the first Bull Run, second Bull Run, and Brandy Station. And thinking that some of you and your spouses might be traveling in that area, if anybody should ever want to attend any of these, that we'll be glad to furnish you with the application. And it just seems a fascinating way to visit some of these places in which you'll have guided tours and seminars to really give you the details, the nitty-gritty you might not know otherwise. And it sounds so fascinating. I'm hoping I might convince my wife to take another one. She's tired of going to battlefields. She sits in the car and I troop all around. And although she has an interest, it doesn't extend to that degree. So I leave her there. We went down to Vicksburg here a couple of years ago, and I was all over that battlefield. But she sat in the car very patiently, and but so I appreciate that. But as I say, until I can convince her that she ought to take these trips with me, it's probably a little boring for her. But anyway, I thought I'd bring that up in case anybody had any interest in that particular one. It's going to be in April. And as I say, if you see me afterward, I'll give you this application if you should wish. Does anybody have any business they wish to bring up at this time? Well, okay. I'm certainly pleased with the turnout tonight. And I think everybody's got a chair now. That's great. I hope there's one left for me somewhere. Warren, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
was hoping Bob Palmer would be here tonight because he's going to order that Gettysburg publication. The last I knew, he needed one more to qualify for a reduced price. Someone has already asked about it. Did we have Palmer's address in the reference in the newsletter? Okay. Refer to the first call. It gives his address, and let him know that you want in if you do. Still in the publications field, the Brunswick Public Library. I decided that keeping back issues of Civil War magazines was kind of stupid on my part. So I'm now turning them over to the local library almost as fast as they come in. And they will also have bound volumes of back files for 3 or 4 years of Civil War Times Illustrated, Blue and Gray, and the Kent State-based academic publications, Civil War News, I believe it is. That'll give you something to browse in if you want to go to the Brunswick Public Library. On the table tonight are two books associated with Nick Picerno's presentation. One is Gould's 1871 Regimental History of the 1st, 10th, and 29th, which I had never read. I got it out of the Bowdoin Library the first of the week, and I'm absolutely fascinated by it. I cannot believe that it was written almost 120 years ago. It reads like John Pullen's history of the 29th Maine. It's just as current as you can ask for. It isn't written in an antique style, outmoded style, and it's got more details about what life was for the men in the ranks than I have encountered most anywhere. Everything from lice to horrendous wounds. It's all spelled out. It's great reading, and it is available at most of the larger libraries. Not here at the Brunswick Public Library, but it is available at the Portland Public Library. It's available at the Maine Historical Society. But, by the way, the books in the library of the Maine Historical Society do not circulate. I got a nasty cold and my voice is going to fail me. Let's hope it holds up for a few minutes longer. We now have our speakers program somewhat in hand for the rest of the year. We had Marius Pelado of our membership scheduled next month. Nick Dean, who's curator of the Spring Point Maritime Museum in South Portland and is one of our members, is going to speak in January about shipping, particularly in reference to Maine shipping and what happened to it during the Civil War. And then a man named Chapin from the South Portland High School History Department is going to talk on somewhat the same area. And we're going to have to do a little coordination so they don't overlap too much. I think he's going to hit more on ship construction by Maine shipyards during the Civil War. Meanwhile, in February, Ron Clay, who spoke exactly 4 years ago, February, is coming back. I think he's going to talk about research in general. Civil War research, that is. And sometime in the spring, another professor from Colby going to talk about the literature that came out of the Civil War, specifically Crane's Red Badge of Courage, but I think he will get into some of the other novels and short stories that were written by people who had actually been active in the war. And that still leaves us with a couple of programs yet to fill. And I've got invitations out to at least 5 individuals, and I hope pretty soon I'm going to hear from a couple of them and we can tie it up for this year. And then I can start worrying about next fall's program. Now, before my voice really dies on me, Nick Picerno, who has been, you read all about him in your first call. I made one error in that. I misinterpreted something that someone else told me. He himself did not have any members of his family in those regiments. I was wrong on that point. Otherwise, it's all okay. Nick, it's yours.
Thank you. Now, usually when I give these talks, especially in Vermont, the fact I'm the chief of police makes it somewhat easier for me because I can go to those Vermont talks I give and threaten those who fall asleep with some very, very, threatening language as far as what could happen to them if they drive away. I started researching and studying the 1st, 10th, and 29th Maine about 10 years ago. It started with me acquiring the colonel's uniform, trunk, and some other of his accoutrements, George Beale from Norway. And I guess it just grew, and it grew, and it grew until we're, at this point, I have several uniforms and well over 600 photographs of different members of the regiment and associated with the regiment. What I'm going to be speaking about this evening is going to be broken up into three phases. First, I'm going to speak about the 1st, 10th, and 29th. Some of it's going to be from the words of one of its colonels, later a brevet major general, George Nye, who was born in Hallowell, lived in Lewiston. In my collection, I have his letters. He wrote to his wife close to 2,500 letters between 1861 and 1866. And you'll see that these are very candid, very poignant letters, and he really has something special to say about the war and the 10th and 29th Maine's part in it. Some of the other people I'm going to quote will be the regimental historian, John Meade Gould, who wrote this book, who Rutherford B. Hayes said was the finest regimental history he had ever read. And he certainly has a great sense of humor, a great sense of wit. One time there was a newsletter that John Gould printed in 1912, and the printer made a simple error, a typo. What John Gould did was on every copy, he corrected the error and wrote, "The printer's a cow." And he's really quite witty. Second phase I want to talk about is we're going to show you some slides. There's a number of them, of men in the regiment. Tell you little stories, little anecdotes about each one of them. There are some other things I'm going to show you, pictures of the battlefield, different battlefields they were on, and their monuments, 10th Maine monuments are there today, and about what the battlefield looks like, and copies of maps from Nye's letters. And the last thing, we're going to questions. I want to talk, do we have any descendants? I know we have a few here. Maybe we can, get into like a question-answer type thing. The 1st Maine, I don't, as was in the first call, this is about the 10th and 29th Maine. But the regimental in the regiment's about the 1st, 10th, and 29th. I get more into the 10th and 29th because theirs was a splendid battle record, a record of death, wounds, battle, all those things you think of in war. The 1st Maine was one of the measles. They were mustered in on May of 1861. John Meade Gould, in the regimental history, wrote, "Though we enlisted to fight and bleed and die, nothing happened to us more serious than the measles." As the members of the 1st Maine boarded to go south to Washington, George Nye, who was a lieutenant at the time, wrote an account of what he saw as they boarded the ship. He said, I saw many a tearful eye, as hand pressed hand for perhaps the last time in this world below. I saw a wife with her husband's hand around her standing near me. As the word for all aboard was passed, they took their parting. She with tearful eyes exclaimed, Goodbye, God bless you, do your duty. They parted, and the prayers of that wife will ever be ascending into heaven for angels to watch over and protect her loved one. Then on June 17th of that year, he was in Washington, D.C. And there was a review going on. Lincoln was reviewing some Pennsylvania troops. Lieutenant Nye got within 4 feet of President Lincoln. And on June 17th, he wrote his wife, whose name was Charlotte, but he called her Charlie, said, Dear Charlie, I stood within 4 feet of the President. The nearer I approached, the plainer he looked. He certainly will never be known for his beauty, no more than myself. Well, they never really got to fight, never got to fight at all. Most of what they were doing was jockeying for position as far as officers. And they were mustered out on August 5th, 1861. They never saw combat. And John Gould wrote, We did what we could. It was not our fault we didn't do any more. Well, the war is still going on. The 1st Maine didn't fight. The men that were in the regiment felt somewhat that they really haven't come to the aid of the country like they should have. Well, the officers got together, and they said, well, let's get back in. And they formed the 10th Maine. And they mustered in on October 4th, 1861, and they certainly would see the combat that they longed for. At first, however, the 10th was assigned to guard duty in the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. They were assigned to different places such as Harper's Ferry, Annapolis, Relay House, an interesting place called the Haunted House. The duties were mundane and had very little contact with the enemy. As a matter of fact, George and I wrote in February of 62, I think the war is fast coming to an end. Well, he was a little bit wrong. One of the things they did do was they occupied Winchester, Virginia. When they occupied Winchester, they went into the old Winchester Republican newspaper office. There, some of the a corporal and a private from one of the companies decided that they wanted to print a newspaper, something for the regiment to read, something for the area to look at. Well, they cleaned off the type. They printed a newspaper called the New Winchester Republican. They printed it on May 23rd of 1862. On May 25th of 1862, they hightailed it out of Winchester due to Banks' retreat. There was never a volume 2. I'm fortunate I have one of those newspapers at home. On August 9th of 1862 was the date the 10th Maine had its first battle. Cedar Mountain or Slaughter Mountain. They lost 173 killed and wounded during that battle. Captain Nye wrote to Charlie, the colonel and major rode in front of the regiment, and it was a great wonder that they escaped. The colonel's horse was struck twice, but not mortally. The regiment did its duty nobly, and if we got no credit for the retreat at Winchester, I don't know why he would think they would, we will get it now. Our flag showed the marks and scars of rebel bullets. Out of 8 color corporals and 2 sergeants, 7 were killed or wounded. And that was at Cedar Mountain. One of the members they lost was a captain by the name of Nehemiah Furbish. I'll show you a photograph of him later. I'm sorry, it was Andrew Cloudman. And a GAR post was named after him after the war. The next day, Captain Nye joined the surgeon, Josiah Day, and he went out to the battlefield of Cedar Mountain to look after the wounded. And Nye wrote, many a God bless you we got as we passed the canteen of water from mouth to mouth. They had been lying from Saturday till Monday with nothing to eat or drink except in what the rebels gave them. A number of the rebels were carrying them water and attended them, which showed some form of compassion on the part of the rebels because they looked after some of the Union wounded on the battlefield. Well, that was quite a battle for them. Captain Nye received a wrist wound, and if you read his letters, his letters are really interesting to read there. He wrote just how badly it hurt, but it was just a simple wrist wound. But to listen to him tell it, you thought that this was a serious, life-threatening wound. But he did that quite a bit in his letters. A little over a month later, the 10th Maine would fight in its largest battle, that being the Battle of Antietam. Assigned to the 1st Division of the 12th Corps, Their commander was General Joseph King Fenno Mansfield from Connecticut. Early on the morning of September 17th, they were engaged in combat in the East Woods. Colonel George Beale was severely wounded in the thigh from a rebel sharpshooter. When he was wounded, he's on his horse. There's a sharpshooter on a tree, shoots the colonel in the thigh, right above the boot. He said it left a 3-inch gash. When he got hit, the bullet went through his leg and into his horse. The horse bucked and kicked the lieutenant colonel, whose name was Philibron, in the stomach. And now both regimental commanders were lost. The major who took over was a man by the name of Charles Walker, who was somewhat timid. And though there were no fingers pointed after the Battle of Antietam, he shortly thereafter resigned. During the battle, that afternoon, the battle's still raging on, and Captain Nye writes to Charlie, "Thank God I am still left as unwounded. We have had a battle today with the rebels. Our loss is pretty severe. The killed and wounded must be great on both sides." He also wrote something else that's kind of interesting. He wrote that he heard that General Lee was captured. Of course, we all know that wasn't true, but that was some of the rumors that were pretty prevalent at the time. But like I said, this was their first battle. 2 weeks later, Captain Nye was in camp in Knoxville, Maryland. He's sitting there reflecting upon the Battle of Antietam because it made a tremendous impact on him. And he wrote the following to his wife, Charlie. "It is singular how anyone will seem to change their motive when in battle. When Captain Furbridge was shot, he stood just by the side of me. He was shot in the head and fell like a log. He never spoke. Not a minute or two later, I heard a bullet strike and looked around as Lieutenant had his hand to his breast and falling over. But an instant later, I heard a thud, the noise a bullet makes when it strikes a person. And looking over my right shoulder, I saw one more of my boys, James D. Eaton, shot through the head. I looked more calmly on the field of carnage than I could a few years ago to have seen a sheep killed. The finer feelings of man is stunted at such times. And I felt when I saw our boys taken in prisoners that there was a quicker way to dispose of them." Now I mentioned that one of his men, James D. Eaton, was shot in the head and killed. In Nye's letters that I have, there are 6 letters written by James Eaton's mother just prior to the battle. Apparently what happened, since he was killed, the letters never went to him, and Nye kept them. If you go to the Antietam National Battlefield Cemetery, James D. Eaton's grave is clearly marked, James D. Eaton, Maine, in the main section of the Antietam battlefield. In February of 1863, Nye is elected major, but Colonel Beale gives it to Captain Charles Emerson because he feels Captain Emerson is senior officer, which he was. This begins some animosity between Colonel Beale and Captain Nye, an animosity that lasts throughout the war. Nye even tries to obtain a commission in some of the new colored regiments, and he doesn't receive it. But the animosity still stays there for quite some time. The service of the 10th Maine was drawing to a close. On April 27, 1863, Nye wrote his wife, "We broke camp and leave here for home in a few hours. Is not this joyous news for you? It is for me." And on May 8, the 10th Maine was mustered out. Regimental historian John Gould wrote, "We were in but 2 battles where we could fire our muskets. Yet in these 2 we lost more men killed and wounded than any other Maine regiment up to the day we left the seat of war to return home." That translated into 73 officers and men killed and 48 died of disease. Now, that's kind of an interesting statistic. More men died in battle in the 10th Maine than died of disease. Usually the reverse of what we all know to be true. Now, unfortunately, there were 2 companies, Companies A and B, that when they signed up, they signed for 3 years. Now the 10th had fought for 2 years, and the 2-year men were getting out. And the 3-year men were preparing to get out too, because, wow, the government won't hold us to this. Well, guess again, the government held them to it. And they had to stay for another year. And they formed a regiment, well, not a regiment, but a battalion, called the 10th Maine Battalion. They were led by Captain John D. Beardsley and were assigned as headquarters guard to the 12th Corps. They guarded Slocum, basically, throughout the rest of their time. They're also the only members of the 10th Maine to oversee action at Chancellorsville or Gettysburg. Though they were there, they never fired a shot. At Chancellorsville, they were stationed right at the Chancellor House. In the spring of 1864, the battalion rejoined the renewed 10th Maine, which is now called the 29th Maine. Now, the 29th Maine sort of happened the same way the 10th Maine happened. The officers got together and say, this thing's not done yet. We fought in some major battles. We need to see it through. And that was a concept that was prevalent amongst those men. They wanted to see the thing through. As a matter of fact, later in the war, the regimental historian, John Gould, wrote that he wished he would have stayed right to the muster-out date, which was in June of 1866. He got out a couple of months earlier, but he always regretted that. These people wanted to see the thing through. As John Gould put it, we were barely out of the service before we wished ourselves back in again. In December of 1863, the 29th Maine was mustered in, and they were first called Beale's Veteran Regiment. They weren't assigned a number, but they wanted to be called the 10th Maine Veterans. That wasn't going to happen. Instead, they were called the 29th Maine Veterans. They were told to wear veteran stripes. And that was, if you read the regimental history and if you read Nye's letters, those veteran stripes were mocked by different other regiments. The 29th Maine then participated in the Red River Campaign. There, the veterans of the 10th were reunited with their old commander, General Nathaniel Banks. They participated in the battles of Sabine Crossroads and Pleasant Hill and were present at the Cane River crossing. All these in April of 1864. Their total loss was 3 killed and 24 wounded. Captain Nye in his diary writes about the Battle of Sabine Crossroads, had a smart battle, drove the rebels back, covered the retreat of the 13th Corps. But you really look at that, they covered a Union retreat, but they drove the rebels back. Service with the 19th Corps in Louisiana resulted in many deaths from disease. They were down in Louisiana, in swamp country, and a great many men died of disease. Now, the surgeon was a fellow by the name of Josiah Day, and Surgeon Day was not very well liked by his men. Prior to the war, he lived in Missouri, and slave people drove him out, and he came back in Maine and enlisted in the 10th. The men of the regiment would rather go to private Confederate rebel doctors, in private practice, than go to their own surgeon. They thought that less of them. At the Battle of 3rd Winchester, the regiment was led by Major William Knowlton of Lewiston. Major Knowlton's an interesting fellow. We're going to see a picture of him in a little while. I'll tell you some more about him. But the day before the Battle of 3rd Winchester, Opequon, he had a premonition. He went to 2 of his captains, Turner and Whitmarsh, and said, "Men, look out after the regiment tomorrow, because tomorrow will be my last battle." And Turner turned to him and said, No. Don't think like that, Major. You'll go right through. It'll be fine. No, tomorrow will be my last battle. Well, the next day during the battle, he's on his horse, looks up, and a bullet hits him right in the neck. And he lingers for 1 day, and he dies. In his letters that I have at home, every one of his letters says, "Love, William." Nothing else at the end. The last letter he wrote, a couple of days before the Battle of 3rd Winchester, he signed it, "Goodbye to all. Love, William." He was referred to as the best officer the regiment ever produced. And on September 22nd, the 29th Maine participated in the Battle of Fisher's Hill, and loss was pretty mild. They only had 4 men wounded. And finally, George Nye is promoted to major, and he leads the regiment in the last of the major Shenandoah Valley battles, that being Cedar Creek. He's wounded. On October 22nd, he writes, "I was wounded by a mini ball in the Battle of the 19th. The ball struck my upper lip on the right-hand side of my nose, broke out 4 of my teeth, fractured my upper jaw, and stopped safely by the side of my tongue, and is now in my pocket as a keepsake." That was a pretty vivid account of just how he got wounded. On November 8th, the regiment voted almost overwhelmingly for Lincoln to be reelected, 175 to McClellan's 41. And the last rebel bullet to hit a 29th Maine was fired on November 12th near Kernstown, Virginia. Barton Ross, therefore, became the last member of the 19th Corps to be wounded, killed, whatever, by a rebel bullet. 1865 begins with Nye as colonel, and the 29th were forming musical camps. They went from camp to camp to camp to camp, guard duty, sort of menial tasks. On April 10th, 1865, word reached the 29th about Lee's surrender. Nye tells Charlie, "We done some tall cheering. I had the band play Hail Columbia, America, the Star-Spangled Banner, and Yankee Doodle." Then reacting to Lincoln's assassination, Nye states, "Blood must pay for it, and the sooner it commences to flow, the better." About a month later, the 29th had the distinction of guarding the Lincoln assassins. On May 5th, Colonel Nye writes the following. Listen to this account of how the prisoners were kept. "The prisoners are heavily ironed, hands to feet, with a 100-pound ball attached. Their heads are covered with a thick pad covering their face and eyes, leaving them just room enough to breathe, and they can take their food. After they eat, the hole is laced up, so they cannot get anything in their mouth, and they're confined separately. Jeff Davis, I hope, will soon be incarcerated in the same prison." Well, he wasn't. That's kind of a graphic account of the way they kept prisoners. I can tell you, though, they do not keep prisoners like that anymore, especially in the state of Vermont. On May 25th, the riff I spoke to earlier about Nye and Beale comes to a head. Beale wants Nye to send a regimental band over to play at brigade headquarters. Well, Nye felt, "Hey, you've been really taking advantage of this band. They seem to be your own personal band and not the regimental band." Now, you won't read about this anywhere. It's not in the regimental history, but it is in Nye's letters. So Nye tells General Beale at this time, "Nope, you can't have the band." And Beale writes back and says, "I'm ordering you to send over the band." Colonel Nye again refuses. At that point, General Beale has Colonel Nye arrested for disobeying orders. He then goes to Major Gould. He says, "Major, I want the members of the band and their instruments right up to division headquarters, promptly." Major Gould, who's a good friend of Colonel Nye, says, "Nothing doing." Well, at this time, what they did, they took all their instruments and they hid them. Now, Major Gould, Colonel Nye are under arrest. Beale wants his band playing there. So he goes to the senior captain, who's Alfred Turner. "Captain Turner, I want the band coming up here directly." He says, "I'd gladly order them to come, but they're going to come without their instruments." And he says, "Why?" He said, "Because we can't locate any. They're all been hidden." And the issue died. Well, to say, Beale was furious. He was very furious about it. And he brought Nye up on charges. However, Colonel Nye had some influential friends, one being Thomas Hubbard. And after a couple days, the whole issue dies. And both Colonel Beale and Major Nye are released from arrest. I mean, these men were really well thought of by their regiment, and so was Colonel Beale. But again, Captain and Colonel Nye always had a bit of animosity because he always felt he should have been major back in December of 1863. Now, the men of the 29th Maine are fully expecting to go home because the war is over. But they made the same mistake that companies A and D did at the 10th. They enlisted for 3 years, and Uncle Sam was not ready to get rid of them at that time. So they're stationed in Darlington, South Carolina, and they become Army of Occupation Forces in South Carolina. And what they do, they're the law. They're to become judges. Major Gould and Colonel Nye presided over many tribunals, murder cases, robbery cases. And they also took care of freedmen's contracts, and they made sure the Freedmen's Bureau worked in that part of South Carolina. They made contracts between the freed slaves and their former masters to work for a fee. And that was their primary duty. They had a number of instances, though, where at this particular time, the war's over, discipline becomes lax. They don't even wear their uniforms anymore. In photographs of the period, while they're in Darlington, they're all in civilian dress. Discipline is lax, their inspections are poor, and the people that inspect them, mention that in their reports. And they are somewhat more of a rabble than they are a regiment. But yet they're still there, they're still doing what they have to do. Some of them, however, do things like burn barns. I remember when I lived in North Carolina, I was a county police sergeant there for several years. And I was always referred to as a barn burner because I was from New York. And you can see why. Now, I gave a talk similar to this based on the 29th Maine's occupation in Darlington, South Carolina a couple of years ago. And I went down there, and there was a big group of people down there, and I said, I never seen a group of rebels fight so hard to get a Yankee down here after you fought so hard to get him out of here. And they were down there, and they left their mark. They left the carpetbaggers. Remember the lieutenant colonel I was telling you about earlier, the one who was kicked in the stomach? He doesn't go into the 29th Maine, but the members of the 29th Maine install him as Justice of the Peace in Darlington, South Carolina. Another man by the name of Benjamin Whittemore, who was the chaplain of the 30th Massachusetts, becomes a U.S. Senator from Darlington, and 30th Massachusetts was brigaded with the 29th, and he's ultimately run out of Congress, run out of the Senate. There was no great love for those people down there. They stole chickens. I'll show you a picture later, the tintype I have of one of their chicken thieves. Burned cotton, called people names. Colonel Nye was getting an influx of letters from a number of people complaining about the regiment. Now they're in it. Now it becomes June 21st, 1866, and the 6th U.S. Infantry goes and relieves the 29th Maine, and they go home. The war's over, but the camaraderie that existed now really takes another form. They form what's called the 1st, 10th, 29th Maine Regimental Association. They meet every year, and they finally buy a cottage on Long Island, just off of Portland. It's a cottage called, in fact, I have pictures of it, and I'll show you some photographs later for those who want to see it. It says 110 29 Maine Association. Every year they meet. It's sort of sad to watch after the years. There are less and less. They get older and older, and it's less and less. To where now, in the 1920s, they're meeting with the 17th Maine, and they're combining it. It was a very, very interesting group. They're really committed to the memory of their regiment. John Gould especially. In 1889, he does a pamphlet, it's about 40 pages, in which he tells where each member of the 1st, 10th, and 29th is living at that time. And I've got that for anybody who's interested in that. But that was done in 1889 by him. He did pamphlets, leaflets every year about their meetings. They had meetings all over the state. They left once to go to Cambridge, Massachusetts, in one of their reunions, but the rest of them were held throughout the state of Maine. The last, I believe he's the last officer, John Gould dies January 1st, 1930. And with him, much of the history of the regiment. Now, what I'm going to show you now, have a light cut. Battle flag. I have one of the stars. Each one of the officers cut out a star after the war, and I have 9 stars. George Field, born in Norway, son of Edward Fluent Field. After the war, before the war, he was a bookbinder, runs Field Hotel in Norway, and died in 1896. He was state treasurer. He was state adjutant general. That picture was taken May 8, 1863. He was presented that sword, the belt and sash, the day before. The sword has inscribed on it the words, merit is better than fame. I own the belt and sash you see there. That's Colonel Beale now as Brigadier General. This picture was taken in January of 1865, a year and a half after the other one. This is George Nye, the colonel I was telling you about, whose letters I have. Born in Howell in 1824. His wife Charlie died in 1881. He died, he lives all over. He lives in Montreal, Laurel, Maryland, native Massachusetts, and died in 1908 in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Interesting enough, his letters were in his trunk. And 25 years ago, they were separated, the trunk and the letters. I was able to get the letters, and I tracked through 25 years of investigating what happened to the trunk. I was able to find the trunk too, and I got that. Sometimes it's helpful being especially when you're speeding. But they say many state troopers don't get enough cops to break. I haven't tried them yet. I don't think I want them. I heard a story one time of a police officer from Massachusetts being stopped by a Maine trooper. He showed his badge. The trooper looked at it, threw it in the ground, and said, "Don't mean nothing here." I don't want to test it. This is Lieutenant Colonel Philibron, the lieutenant colonel who was kicked in the stomach. He was the one who became a carpetbagger after the war and just peace in Darlington, South Carolina. This is Lieutenant Colonel Emerson. Now, you remember me telling you that he was put in the rank of major even though Nye was elected? Well, Nye and Emerson were close friends up until then. In 1864, Nye writes Charlie to be seen by the men to be a coward and a scalawag. And the reason being he was sick. But their friendship really eroded. And there was a lot of it going on. Now, the regimental history mentions that they didn't have any of the bitter squabbling that other regiments had. Well, maybe they didn't have as much, but they certainly had a share of it. That's the regimental historian, John Gould. This is him as the first lieutenant and adjutant of the regiment. And this is him in 1912. See the contrast again. This is Surgeon Day, Josiah Day, who I spoke of earlier. He went through all the regimental reunions until he died in Peabody, Massachusetts, but not very well thought of. As a matter of fact, on many occasions, General Deal petitioned the states to send down another surgeon to replace him. And Surgeon Day, when he picked up on it, wrote letters saying, "There's not a problem. I'm being treated unfairly." Well, they had too many things to worry about, so they just left him in there. That's the quartermaster, Charles Thompson, who was the brother of Colonel Deal's wife, Belinda Thompson Deal. This is the chaplain, Knox. Chaplain Knox is from Lewiston. In 1864, in November, he became a statistician. He became one of 11 chaplains killed during the war. However, it wasn't by a rebel bullet, but by a Yankee horse. And the horse bumped and reared, he fell off, hit his head in a rock, and the horse rolled over him. Another photograph of him. Really highly thought of by his men. Wrote letters home for the men. After he died, Colonel Nye took over that task. Many letters written by Nye. Very highly thought of. And as John Gould wrote, he's a true Christian gentleman. This is Charles Graham, Charles Crickmore Graham, born in Perth, Scotland. He was one of the color bearers, one of the ones that lived at the Battle of Antietam. He wrote after the war that as he was carrying the colors into battle, he noticed one of the captains from the Portland Mechanic Blues, by the name of Ned Kendall, coming towards him, wearing a gray uniform, leading a regiment. But one of their predecessors now became one of their adversaries. William Dodge. William Dodge's father, also William Dodge, was a private in the 10th Maine. And this photograph shows him as a lieutenant in 16th. The reason I've included him is there's a story in regimental history about when he was in the 10th, he was cooking some beans, and he put it in a dirt, he's baking them in a dirt heart. Well, they had to retreat, and he had to cover them up. He joins the 16th Maine, who fought at Gettysburg, and he comes to the same spot where the beans were. And he looks, and he says, I wonder if they're there. Maybe not. Well, maybe they are. So he digs them up, and there they are still in the pot a year and a half later. Herbert Sargent was a captain in the 10th, later became a captain in the 31st Maine. William Whitmarsh, also from Norway, became a major in the Maine militia after the war. He was an aide to General Deal. Nehemiah Furbis. This is the captain who, at the Battle of Antietam, had his revolver drawn, coming into the East Woods, and he's killed instantly. He's going to fall back like a log. He's buried not too far from where he fell, and when the 29th went back down, the 29th Maine found his remains and buried him, brought him back home. This is a picture of members of the 10th Maine at the Battle of Cedar Mountain. I include this because this picture appears in Miller's photographic history. Have you ever seen that? Some of you are familiar with that. Well, there's only one person that's identified correctly. That's him, William Milton. Well, in 1913, John Gould, the Miller's now a year old, John Gould gets a copy of it. He says, that's not who they are. And he prints exactly who they are in his, this fellow is identified as a captain by the name of Littlefield, who resigned 6 months before Cedar Mountain, so sooner than him. What they are is, this is Fuller Brown, this is the surgeon, that's Captain Black, and this is the sergeant, Jordan, and that's said that we couldn't really remember at that time. So he printed exactly where it was at. There's a monument to the 10th Maine at the battlefield, Cedar Mountain. Now, I've included here because it's kind of a sad story for those who see battlefield presentation. John Gould went there and had the monument set. Now, this monument's in the cornfield. The monument stays here. Over here is a monument to 46th Pennsylvania. This is part of the brigade. Over here is a monument to the 28th New York, another part of the brigade. Right here is a brand new $150,000 home. You can see where something has hit it and it's knocked it off its face. I also learned there is another monument which lists the names and then died. It's a pretty big square piece of granite. It really was difficult to find. It took a couple hours. Right in the middle of the cornfield. This is General Mansfield. Now, there was quite a debate after the war between Major Gould, John Gould, and some officers of the 125th Pennsylvania. And the debate, interesting enough, was where was Mansfield actually killed? If you go to the Antietam battlefield today, you will notice one of the informational tablets there. There's a photograph of Mansfield, and it tells about how he's talking to men of the 10th Maine. He's saying, "Don't fire, those are our own men." And a sergeant by the name of Thomas Waite replies, "No, General, they're not our own men, they're rebels." At that time, Mansfield was shot. As he falls off the horse, a captain by the name of Jordan, we'll see just in a minute, see if that's him. No. Jordan grabs onto him, grabs onto his hat cord, and had the hat cord till after the war. The hat is taken by Captain Nye. He returns it in 1880 to the general's son, and the gauntlets are given to William Milton by one of the privates out of his company, Company F. But the big controversy was where exactly did Mansfield die? And I'll show you just a minute out of the map, but the men of the 10th were there, and the men of the 125th said it happened somewhere behind there. So it was quite a debate that raged on into the 1880s until they all got together in 1890, and they pretty much solved it. But there was still a little bit of animosity there. Now, this is the spot where John Gould went in 1891. This is the spot where Mansfield was mortally wounded. Like I said, this was a controversy. And he was going to say, not only did he go to the show, he made sure there was a permanent marker there. nobody's going to say otherwise. Well, they put that marker there in 1891, and this is the same spot April of last year. Now, what you can't see in this photograph or in the other photograph, the reason they knew exactly where it was is right here is a great big boulder. And at the battlefield of Antietam, wherever a general was killed, is an inverted cannon. I think there's 6 of them on the battlefield, maybe more. This field stone is built on a boulder. There's a boulder there, and that's where it's built on. Now, Mills Cornfield is right here. The monument to Mansfield, there is a monument to his death, is about 100 feet over this way, and here's the cornfield. Now, I don't know if some of you know this, but the cornfield, Millis Cornfield, was privately owned. And if, the way I understood it, if somebody wanted to put a Wendy's hamburgers in the middle of it, it was possible. Well, a group out of Virginia, a conservation group, purchased Millis Cornfield. Now it's been purchased for to keep it the way it was during the war. Here's the map that Captain Nye drew of the Battle of Antietam. This is the line that goes eastward. Here's where Mansfield was killed. This is where Burbage is killed. And this is where Nye was, Company K. Look what he writes here. Captain Black fell out with the bellyache before the battle. Well, Captain Black was sort of chastised after the battle for that. There was a lot of rumor that circulated. And one of the general orders that came out by Colonel Beale was not to do this, to resist from doing it. Captain Black had an interesting job after the war. Anybody know what he was? He was chief of police in Portland. This is William Paddy Jordan, who was a captain. He was very short. We used to call him the Rooster. He was the one who caught General Mansfield as he was falling off his horse. Henry Martin Binney. Here's an interesting story. He's in the 10th Maine. This picture was taken when he was in the Massachusetts militia. Do we know about the siege of Harper's Ferry in 1862? Dixon Miles was the colonel in charge of the Union units down at Harper's Ferry. And of course, Jackson and Hill are going over towards Antietam, but they stop to capture Harper's Ferry. And Harper's Ferry is surrendered. At the time of the surrender, Dixon Miles is killed by rebel artillery. Until today, there's some speculation that maybe he was a traitor. He and Captain Binney were very close friends. Captain Binney was his aide. Although he was a member of the 10th Maine, he was attached to Dixon Miles. He holds the unfortunate record of being the only officer dismissed that was in the 10th Maine. The reason is, kind of interesting, he wanted to prove that Dixon Miles was not a traitor. And what he did was, he forged the company books, the order book, to say something to the effect that Miles, that don't surrender till the cow's tails fall off. Of course, when he did that, he forgot that if you're going to write down June 26th on a page, it's usually better that the preceding page wasn't June 28th. Well, he's caught, and he's dismissed for gross deception on the U.S. government. Well, he didn't like that, and John Gould didn't like him. There's a letter after the war where he tries to redeem himself, and I guess he lied to John Gould, and that was one of the things he didn't do. Run away in battle and lie was two of the things he didn't appreciate. He does enlist in the 28th Massachusetts, which part of the regiment, in a book called Irish Green, I don't know if you've seen that, some of the regiment was made up of people that were dismissed or had some sort of disciplinary action taken upon them. They became officers in 28th Massachusetts. He becomes a lieutenant in 28th, or captain in 28th Massachusetts, and is wounded twice. I believe it was Spotsylvania and Wilderness, and is mustered out. His name is Henry Martin Binney. In the 28th Massachusetts, he enlisted as Martin Henry Benny. He tried to fool him. This is a hand-drawn map. I don't know if you can see it real well. That Captain Nye drew of Harper's Ferry. Dennis Fry, who is one of the historians at the Harper's Ferry Battlefield Park, looked at this, and everything on it is very, very accurate. He took a lot of time drawing that map. Potomac River, the bridge, this Arsenal is, John Brown's Fort. Here's an interesting story. Now, have you seen this photograph before? Anybody seen it before? This photograph appears in January, on the calendar, January, the month of January, on the Time Life Civil War calendar next year. This is Sergeant Hezekiah Elwell, or Kai Elwell, as John Gould called him. And this is Corporal William Wentworth. In the middle is the dog Major. Now, you may have read about Major in the 10th, 29th Maine Regimental history. Major is a Newfoundland dog. I like the word Newfoundland, because that's how they found him. He jumped from one train out of New Hampshire troops, the 1st New Hampshire, and jumped onto the 10th Maine train as they're going south. This dog likes war. Well, he had a nasty habit, and that was biting after the dust the bullet makes after it strikes the ground. And he lived right through the 10th Maine service, and at one point his owner tried to claim him from the regiment. But they protected the dog, and the owner never did get him back. During the break between the 10th and 29th, Captain by the name of Granville Blake took care of Major and had him a silver collar made. He had a silver collar made and said, Major on it. At the Battle of Sabine Crossroads on April 8th of 1864, Major's up to his old tricks again, biting that bullet. One bit him first, and he was killed. He's buried, and Captain Blake decided to keep the collar. Now, one of the things I'd like to do is track down the census. I want to find out as much about out of the Auburn GAR post about the dog Major, how Captain Blake still retained it at that time. Now, when I first got this picture, I was living in a town called Southern Pines, North Carolina, and then I moved up to Vermont. Well, I did some tracking down, got pension records. I said, I want to track down Captain Blake's descendants. Captain Blake, after the war, died in Southern Pines, North Carolina, the town I just came from. Now, the two men in this photograph didn't have, Kai Elwell, he lived after the war. He was reduced in rank. He was disciplined. William Wentworth died of diarrhea in Louisiana. This is the story about how I found out who he was. Is kind of interesting. This photograph has in the back of it some orange paper, and old black ink attached to it, and he's only identified as Corporal Black. Well, there was no Corporal Black after Order 29th Maine. So there was somewhat of a dilemma. Who is this person? He's also known as the Judge. About a year later, talking to one of my collector friends, what do you got for 10th, 29th Maine? Which is what I say about 15 times a week to everybody. They got this tintype of a guy, Corporal. What's his name? Judge Black, alias William Wentworth. I got the picture, it's the same guy, and so I got to know who he was. This is the original tintype that I have at home in the collection. This is Granville Blake, the man who died in North Carolina, who took care of Major, and so did his company. Albert Kingsley, who was a very close friend of George Nye's, he was his lieutenant in Company K. He moves to California and dies out there in Los Angeles after the war. Captain King, the reason I included him in here, he was one of the men that was in the 10th Maine Battalion. He becomes a colonel in the Massachusetts militia after the war. And Lieutenant Fowler. This is a nice photograph. For those of you who really get into the accoutrements and uniforms, if you look, he's got his pen up here. It's in a star. The star was the 12th Corps badge. That's Edwin Fowler from Saco. This is some of the art that Captain Nye drew. He's a great artist. When he would write his letters to Charlie, he would draw these beautiful designs on the top, "My dearest Charlie," or "Dearest Forever." And this is a drawing he drew to his daughter, Clara, about how they are at camp. Really look, they're busy people, aren't they? This guy's sitting down taking it. Reminds me of some of my cops. He's sitting on a tree. This one's washing his hands. This one's leaning on a tree. This one's holding up a chimney. I got a couple of cops in my department just like this. I got a pretty big department, but they're about like someone like that. Nah, not really. Well, maybe some. This is a map that George and I drew of the Red River Dam. Here are the boats. There's a legend to what they are. We're a scout, and we're the lodge. And here's the camp of the 29th Maine right here. That's going to be included in a book on Louisiana during the Civil War. I enjoy sharing everything. There's a few collectors. If they have something like this or a photograph, it's theirs, and nothing's going to pry from their hands to publish in a book and share with others. I think it's real selfish. Like many of these photographs have been published in Time Life books and in from Winchester C3. This is going to go in the Louisiana book. Major William Knowlton. Told you a little story about him and his premonitions. I'll tell you another story about him now. I love these stories. His wife was Harriet Knowlton. Today she's buried right next to him at Riverside Cemetery in Lewiston, but you wouldn't know it if you knew about her post-war record. Major Nye wrote a letter to Charlie. Stay away from Mrs. K. Hey, right. And he said the reason was Mrs. K was having an illicit affair with Captain Rankin of the 29th. That they had been seen in the International Hotel together. And, they were carrying on. And and this was after he died. But they were carrying on. And the reason that there was there was some exchange of dialogue about these people was that Nye wanted that uniform. Actually, this isn't that one, but he wanted his uniform, his major's uniform, which I own now today. But he wanted his major's uniform. Mrs. K wanted $20 for it. And Captain Nye thought that was too much. Major Nye thought that was too much money. But apparently she was having these affairs. Now, after the war, she moves to Minnesota. And she takes up with a guy by the name of Stinchfield. She lives with him for about 30 years. And if you look at his pension file, you'll see where there were a number of people from the town in Minnesota where they moved to wrote letters to the Pension Bureau. She's living in sin. She should not be getting his pension. She continued to get the pension. Stinchfield dies. She moves back to Lewiston and is buried next to Major Knowlton. Yep. Took him for his money. Oh, was he cheap, too? I got his letters. This guy was tight. You talk about bark in a tree? I mean, he was tighter than the fibers of a tree. This guy, he would write his wife letters. The bills this month are too high. Keep the bills lower. Nothing about war. I mean, his letters are kind of boring. The bills are too high. Lower the bills. The bills were like $30 a month. And back then it was a lot of money. She was not very sad when she learned that he was killed. Albert Turner, he's the one that had the instruments hidden from General Beale. He was from Biddeford. Lorenzo Dow Stacy. He's a lieutenant here in the 29th Maine. He did something quite extraordinary during the war, during the Shenandoah Valley. He captures a flag from a Southern regiment, has the flag in his possession, when this guy, Colonel Love of the 116th New York, says, Lieutenant Dow, I want that flag. Well, do you know what capturing a flag did for you during the Civil War? It was a surefire way to get a Medal of Honor. So he goes, give me that flag. I captured the flag. I'm a colonel. I want the flag. He gives him the flag. He gets it to Sheridan. Guess what he gets? A Medal of Honor. So actually there was no man from the 10th to 29th Maine who won a Medal of Honor. There is a man from the 1st by the name of Durgan, Warren Durgan. He won it because he was one of Lincoln's pallbearers when he went to the Veterans Reserve Corps. But Lorenzo D'Alstacey, this sword-carrying gentleman from the 29th Maine, should have gotten the Medal of Honor. And Colonel Love. That's a great name. How can you deny a guy whose name is Colonel Love? Colonel Love gets the Medal of Honor, becomes a brevet brigadier general, and he claimed capturing the flag. Edward S. Butler of Lewiston, he was the commander of Company A of the 29th Maine. This is Captain Benjamin Redland. Lived in Portland after the war, was a great friend of John Gould. They conversed quite a bit. As a matter of fact, much of John Gould's research he gained from talking with Ben here. This is Ben in 1863, in May of 1863. Ben has the distinction of being with the regiment the longest, from 61 right to 66. Now look at him in 63, now look at him in 66. That's Ben in 66. He dies around 1910 or 1911. This is Corporal Abiel Edwards. He was from Lewiston. He was a real congenial type guy. They all liked him. Matter of fact, many of the photographs that you're seeing today were in his personal photograph album. He didn't live longer after the war. He died in 1876. But he was made postmaster for that area of South Carolina after the war in late 1865, 66. He was the postmaster of the regiment, and John Gould mentions him in the regimental history. You know what these guys are? Chicken thieves and barn burners. This is Corporal Edwards. This is Williams. He's a chicken thief. This is Jumper. He's a barn burner. But what they did wasn't very significant, and they only spent 30 days in jail. That's a photograph of the tintype. Azro Hibbert. Azro Hibbert was a captain in the 31st Maine, served in the 10th Maine. After the war, he formed a group called Comrades of the Battlefield. Tried to be sort of a fraternal organization, something like the GAR or MOLIS. It never really took off. But he was at Cedar Mountain and fought with the 10th Maine. That's a photograph of a tintype that I have. Shows what the 10th Maine looked like when they first went in. They were issued at first Enfield muskets, and they later threw them away and took Springfields off the battlefield. And I've got one of the Springfields that was used by the 10th Maine, and the guy, I know who used it. Shoulder scales, gloves, these guys are fit to go. The shoulder scales really came off shortly thereafter. But most of the 10th Maine tintypes you see when they first enlisted looked like that. I've got 12. These are company I. Alfred Hicks, member of the 10th Maine, later claimed to have been on guard duty or present. I think it was guard duty the night Lincoln was assassinated. He was at Ford's Theater. I think he's probably one of 6,000 who claimed to have been guard. He might have been walking along the Potomac maybe, but he did claim that after the war. As a matter of fact, there's a photograph of him at the Maine Historical Society where he writes on the back of the photograph that he was present at the time. George Coburn, who was a captain in the 29th Maine, I included him here because when John Gould did the list in 1889 as to what happened to the men of the regiment, all he put down for Captain Coburn was assassinated in New York City, 1866. And nobody ever knew what happened to him. Alpheus Green, another close friend of John Gould, he went south to South Carolina with him after the war to try to go in the lumber business, which didn't prove out to be successful. He was also one of the band leaders. Okay. We have the lights there. One of the things about researching this regiment is one of the nicest things is some of the little anecdotes, some of the stories you find out. Now, I mentioned a number of them to you. Things such as Lorenzo Dow Stacy should have received the Medal of Honor, and General Love took it from him. Things such as the illicit affairs that Mrs. Knowlton was having. These are all in the letters. And you do see a lot of them, a lot of these little anecdotes throughout the letters. What I'm doing with the letters is I've already got a publisher for them. I have a word processor and a computer, and I'm transcribing them and putting them into and annotating them to go into book form. As mentioned in the flyer, those people who are descendants of anyone who served in either of those regiments, let me know after the talk this evening, so I can get your name and address, and you'll get a copy of the book gratis. I think that I know this is going to sound corny, especially from a cop, but the 10th and 29th Maine has given me a lot of pleasure and satisfaction reading and studying and learning about them. And I guess there's some way I can kind of repay them for it. As I mentioned, there was all sorts of stories. They used to sit around and discuss the battles when they used to meet at Long Island. I enjoy reading about John Gould telling about his fireside chats with Ben Redlin. They had all the little nicknames. There's a fellow by the name of Ezekiel Hansen, who was known as Zeke, became a Maine department commander for the GAR in the 1920s. And they all would meet. And like I say, it's somewhat poignant to look at the letters to see how, during time, these men are getting older, and you certainly you can see it, and how there's less and less of them at these reunions. These reunions were a very, very important thing to them. They really enjoyed them and looked forward to them. The last one was 1934. There was only four or five people attended, and that was the last one they had. The books, there are 3 books that, well, actually it's 2 books that contain a good deal of information about the 10th. Of course, that's the regimental history I told you about. And then John Gould wrote in 1890 a book called The Death of General Mansfield. And we talked about that earlier, and where that was, to him, that was very important to know exactly where he was killed. It's a pamphlet. It's about 27 pages. It reiterates much of what I just talked to you tonight about as far as who caught him, where he was. And that book, again, it's a very explicit account of what happened to General Mansfield at the time of Antietam. Other books, for those of you who want to read up on the subject, is Maine in the War. There's another book that just came out called Antietam, the Soldier's Battle, by a fellow by the name of John Priest, I believe, who mentions Gould in it many times. And that's another good book to read up about it. Does anybody have any questions at all? There's got to be a host of questions. I don't know what happened. I wish I did. I've never been out there. I've had this urge to go up there sometime. I know they bought it with funds that they raised because I have the amount they paid for it at the time written. But I don't know whatever happened to the cottage. I'd like to know what happened to the sign. You know who'd like to have that, don't you, Marius? No, never did. I will, though. John Gould did. You mean from the picture? Well, you know, as soon as you brought that up, because my wife had close friends who used to breed Newfoundlands, and it doesn't look like one. But there were 2 accounts of Major, and I'm trying to see if I can find one now for you to read. Well, yeah, I think if he's anything, he's probably half Newfoundland, half something else, because Newfoundland's a great big black dog. I mean, they're a great big black dog, but this one certainly isn't. Yes, sir.
No friend of mine had a puppet